She had lost her house, her father, and every soft place the world once offered her. And still she stood against the wall of that candlelit hall as if she owed the room an apology simply for breathing in it. Then the richest man in the county opened his mouth in Latin, sure that a servant in a plain gray dress could never follow him. He was wrong. And what she said back in front of every powerful family in Marrow County changed the direction of both their lives before the candles even burned low. If this is the first story of mine you have found, stay a moment longer, tap that follow button, and tell me in the comments which city you are watching from tonight, because I love seeing how far these old Virginia stories travel. The summer of 1816 pressed down on Marrow County, Virginia, thick and slow, the kind of heat that made even wealthy people restless in their fine clothes. The air in Ashworth Hall smelled of melted wax, cut hay, and the particular perfume of people performing kindness for an audience they assumed was too dull to notice the performance. Eliza Hartwell stood near the east wall of the parlor, counting the quarter chimes of the grandfather clock behind her, because counting was the only freedom left to a woman who was not permitted to sit, speak, or be looked at as anything more than furniture with good posture. She was 26 years old, wearing the same gray dress she had worn for 3 summers, let out at the seams twice, pressed so often the fabric had gone thin at the elbows. In her arms she carried a small bundle of letters for her employer, Mrs. Whitfield, and she held them the way she held everything given to her by wealthy people, carefully, correctly, without complaint. No one in that room looked at her, and that was not an accident. That was simply how the room was built. Her father, Reverend Joseph Hartwell, had built her differently. He had been a traveling preacher and a scholar, a stubborn and gentle man who believed a girl's mind was no smaller than a boy's simply because the world had decided otherwise. He taught her Latin before she turned 10, French before she turned 12, then law, scripture, and the long history of nations ruined by men who mistook cruelty for wisdom. When he died, he left her nothing but that knowledge, which, as she quickly learned, a poor woman in Virginia could not spend, could not present in a courtroom, and could not use to stop a moneylender named Silas Grady from arriving at her door with a debt paper she had never seen, backed by a sheriff who had no interest in reading it closely. She lost the house in March, found her position with Mrs. Whitfield in April, and arrived at Ashworth Hall in June with one trunk and a face that had learned the safest place to hide her true self was in plain sight. The party moved around her that evening the way parties always did. Men in dark coats argued about tobacco prices and the moral failures of people they had never met. Women drifted between them, practicing the art of being present without taking up space. Mrs. Whitfield sat near the fireplace with her niece Louisa close at her side, a lovely girl of 19 who kept her eyes low, her hands folded, and her opinions carefully swallowed. At the center of the room stood the man everyone else in it was performing for. Edmund Ashworth was 35, tall, dark-coated, and carried himself with the stillness of a man who had decided long ago that showing feeling was a debt he refused to owe. He had practiced law in Richmond before his father's death, handed him the plantation and every burden that came with it. People called him brilliant and cold in the same admiring breath, which told Eliza exactly what the county valued in its men. The trouble started with a conversation about a proposed schoolhouse for the county's children. A red-faced planter named Mr. Redgrave wondered aloud whether teaching reading to every child, rich or poor, might invite disorder rather than progress. The room, as rooms always do, leaned toward the wealthiest voice in it, and that voice belonged to Edmund. He swirled the wine in his glass and said that education without station was like handing a lantern to a man walking straight into a wall. The light does not change his direction. It only lets him see the wall more clearly before he hits it. Several men laughed. Then his gaze drifted, the way a powerful man's gaze drifts at a party, careless and half amused, and it landed on Eliza. She did not look away, because looking away would have looked like guilt. He studied her plain dress, her still face, and something in his expression settled into quiet certainty. He turned back to his circle of educated friends and spoke a line of Latin, clear and easy, meant only for the men close enough to appreciate the joke. It translated roughly to this: a beggar may carry a silver cup, but the cup was never made for him. The men who understood laughed softly. The particular laugh of educated men enjoying cruelty dressed up as wit. Eliza's fingers tightened on the letters just once, just enough to feel the paper bend, then she loosened them slowly, deliberately, the way she had learned to loosen every response she was not yet ready to give. The room had already moved on when Eliza lifted her head. She did not raise her voice, did not make a scene, did nothing that would have given anyone permission to dismiss her. She simply answered him in Latin, calm and clear, pitched at the exact same conversational volume he had used, spoken to no one in particular and therefore to everyone at once. A silver cup may still hold clean water, sir, but a golden one can be poisoned. The silence that followed did not fall all at once. It moved like a wave, starting with the guests closest to her and spreading outward as each face turned to confirm what it had just heard. Edmund turned around. His expression was not anger exactly, and not embarrassment exactly, but something more unsettled than either, the look of a man who has reached for a door he has opened 1,000 times only to find it locked from the inside. Eliza did not stop. She shifted into French, smooth and unhurried, the French of a woman who had learned it before she was 12 from a father who believed she deserved every language the world tried to lock away from her. "You mistook my poverty for ignorance, sir," she said, "and that is not intelligence. That is laziness dressed up as judgment." A few of the women in the room understood French perfectly well, and their faces flickered with recognition before their training smoothed them flat again. Then Eliza spoke plain Virginia English, so that every person in the room, educated or not, wealthy or not, could follow every single word. She turned toward her employer with the calm expression of a woman reporting on the weather, and asked whether she should leave the letters on the writing table or hold them until the guests had gone. Mrs. Whitfield, who had missed the entire exchange in Latin and French, told her simply to leave them on the table, and Eliza did, smoothing the top letter with 2 fingers exactly as she always did, then curtsying to her employer alone, and walking toward the door in 12 counted steps, unhurried, because she had said what she came to say, and now she was finished. If you have ever swallowed an insult in a room full of people who assumed you could not understand what was being said about you, this next part of Eliza's story is for you, so stay with me and I promise the door only gets more interesting from here. At the doorway, she heard Edmund speak for the first time since her answer, not to her, but to the room. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I believe we were discussing land reform." No one moved back into conversation right away. Eliza walked the corridor alone, breathing slow and even through her nose, the discipline her father had once called the scholar's breath, until she reached the small servant's sitting room at the end of the hall. There her hands finally shook, not from fear alone, but from the strange relief of a woman who has set down something impossibly heavy for the first time in 11 months. She let herself tremble for exactly 4 minutes, then folded her hands and began preparing herself for dismissal, because Mrs. Whitfield was practical, and a companion who made scenes was a companion who could be replaced. She thought, sitting there in the heat, about her father's courtroom losses, about the many farmers he had defended in front of judges who had already decided the verdict before the first witness spoke, and about the words he used to repeat to her when she asked why he kept losing and kept going anyway. The truth does not need you to win. It only needs you to say it. She said it again silently that night in all 3 languages, one after another, until the trembling in her hands finally settled into something steadier, something closer to resolve than fear. She was still sitting there when she heard measured, deliberate footsteps stop outside her door, followed by a single knock. She opened it to find Edmund Ashworth standing in the corridor, his coat still on, his wine glass gone, His face caught somewhere between a decision his feet had already made and a dignity that had not yet caught up. He asked, quietly, how she had come to know Latin and French so well for a companion carrying another woman's letters. She told him plainly. Her father had been a scholar and a preacher who refused to believe his daughter's mind was worth less than a son's. She told him about the house lost in March, about the debt paper from Silas Grady that arrived only 6 weeks after her father's funeral, about a sheriff who never looked closely enough, and about the strange, cold clarity that had settled over her the day she realized the document itself was wrong. Edmund's stillness in that moment was not the stillness of boredom, but the focused stillness of a man in a courtroom who had stopped forming his next question and started actually listening to the answer. When he asked what proof would look like, she told him about the phrase buried in the paper, language from the county debt registry that did not exist until the spring of 1815, though the document claimed her father signed it in the autumn of 1814. No honest paper drafted before a law exists can quote that law's own wording, she said, and no one drafting it honestly would have made that mistake. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, and he called it, carefully, a significant legal observation. She told him she had told no one else. He asked about Grady and told her, in the precise register of a lawyer choosing his words, that the man had won 3 land disputes in the county in the past 4 years, and that men connected to those cases had old, quiet arrangements with several powerful families, arrangements that made exposing him not just inconvenient, but dangerous, for anyone without the standing to absorb the consequences, and for anyone with the standing who chose to use it anyway. He invited her to return the next morning, to read in his father's library, if she wished. She told him she came every morning already, since delivering Mrs. Whitfield's letters brought her past that very corridor, and he said, quietly, that he knew. She came back that next morning, and the morning after that, and the mornings became a kind of parallel silence, 2 people reading different books in the same room, comfortable in a way she was careful not to trust too quickly. The conversation grew slowly. He asked what she thought was the greatest failure of English property law as it applied to women in Virginia, and she answered without softening a single word, and they argued about land tenure for 40 minutes. And she won, and he told her plainly that she had won, which surprised her more than the argument itself. One morning she brought a ledger she had bought with a week's wages, filled with careful notes tracking exactly when certain legal phrases first entered the county's public documents over 12 years. He studied it for a long while, then told her quietly that this was the work of a lawyer. "My father's work," she said. "No," he answered, "yours." One morning Edmund asked why she had never sought a lawyer of her own to challenge Silas Grady's paper through the proper channels, and she told him she had tried 3 lawyers in the county and 2 more in Richmond. The first refusing without a retainer she could not pay. The second explaining that without a male guardian to bring the claim forward she had no legal standing at all, and the third, a man named Ellery Crane, simply telling her to find a husband. Edmund set his book down flat on the table and asked which third, and when she said Crane, something tightened visibly in his jaw, because he knew the man had sat on the county bench during one of Silas Grady's earlier disputes, and the silence that followed was the silence of 2 people arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion from 2 very different directions. Louisa noticed, of course she did, because Louisa was 19 and watchful in the way intelligent people become watchful when they have nothing else to do with their intelligence. She caught Eliza returning from the library one morning later than usual and asked, gently, whether Edmund was different with her than with everyone else. Eliza thought about it honestly and admitted that he seemed less certain that silence was the same thing as safety, and that this felt like a change in him. Louisa stopped walking and told her, in a voice suddenly younger and less composed, that her aunt intended for her to marry Edmund, that she did not want to. and that her wanting or not wanting had never mattered to anyone arranging her life. She was not warning Eliza away, she said, only warning her what she was walking into. Because Edmund's mother, Constance Ashworth, was arriving from Richmond at the end of the month, and Constance had a very clear idea of what her son should be, who he should marry, and what role every woman in that household was permitted to occupy. This is exactly the kind of turning point where I want you to pause and share this story with someone who needs to hear that quiet, steady work eventually gets seen. Because Eliza's fight was just beginning, and it only got harder from here. The mornings deepened. Edmund admitted, without being asked, that his own father had built that library believing a man without books was a man who had agreed to be smaller than he was, and that he himself had become, in his own flat words, a very principled man in every room where principle cost him nothing. Eliza told him, plainly, that he was not cruel because he felt nothing. He was cruel when he was cruel, because he was terrified someone would discover that he felt everything, and that the Latin remark in the parlor had not been the words of a man who did not care what others thought, but of a man desperate for the room to see him as untouchable, so that no one would ever try to touch the thing underneath he had been guarding since his father died. He went very still, then walked to the shelves without answering, and told her only that she was a very inconvenient person to have in one's library, and she agreed and did not apologize. Constance Ashworth arrived exactly as expected, upright, composed, and precise. She found Eliza in the servants' sitting room and told her plainly that intelligence without position was a lamp without oil, capable of light but incapable of producing it, and that her son's distraction, however understandable, was finished. Eliza asked whether finished meant Constance had told him so, or that he had agreed, and the silence that followed was unlike any silence that had come before it. The silence of a woman who had walked in expecting to deliver a verdict and instead found the defendant asking about jurisdiction. Constance left without answering, and Eliza sat back down and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed the scholar's breath until the shaking stopped. 3 days later, not 4, the note arrived, carried by the household steward, Talbot, whose face gave nothing away, though his eyes told a different story. It was from Constance, brief and upright in its handwriting, informing Eliza that a document concerning the estate of the late Reverend Joseph Hartwell had come to her attention, and that given certain recent conversations in the household, the matter would be addressed at a county hearing before Judge Marrow that Friday morning, attendance required. Eliza understood immediately what this was. Mr. Redgrave, the planter who had laughed softly at the Latin joke months earlier, held old arrangements with Silas Grady's allies. And this was not a hearing meant to examine anything fairly. It was a hearing built to end her, to produce whatever paper Constance had obtained, and to bury Eliza Hartwell so completely that no library conversation in Virginia would ever raise her up again. She carried the note straight to the library. Edmund was there, holding a book he was not reading. He read the note, and though his face did not change, his hands tightened once on the paper before deliberately loosening. "This is her move," he said. "Yes," Eliza answered. "And she got there before I did. I should have anticipated it." "You could not have anticipated the speed," he said. "She has been planning this since before she arrived." Something in Eliza went cold, clear, and very still, the particular stillness that comes not from an absence of fear, but from the arrival of purpose. "Then I have until Friday morning," she said, "and that is enough time." She told him the truth without softening it, that when she stood in that room, she intended every word she spoke to be so precise, so documented, and so unassailable that the only way anyone could discredit it would be by discrediting themselves in front of the entire county. And then she asked him plainly whether he intended to be in that room when she did it. "I will be there," he said, and when she told him he did not have to be, that this was her fight and not his burden, he told her he knew it was not his burden, and that he was choosing to place it on himself anyway. Friday morning arrived heavy with heat. The courthouse, packed with the same families who had stood in that candlelit parlor months before. Judge Marrow presided with the careful boredom of a man who expected the outcome to be settled before the first word was spoken. Constance produced the debt paper, aged and official-looking, and Silas Grady's lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Ellery Crane, walked the court through it with practiced confidence, describing a widow's daughter too proud and too ambitious to accept a debt fairly owed. When it was her turn, Eliza did not raise her voice. She opened her father's old Blackstone notebook, laid out her 3 careful pages, and walked the room plainly and without flourish, through the exact date the county debt registry provision had been enacted in the spring of 1815, and the exact phrase in the disputed document that borrowed language from that very provision, though the paper claimed to have been signed the previous autumn, months before that language existed anywhere in Virginia law. She named the clerk who had let her examine the original registry records. She named the dates. She named the pattern of Silas Grady's 3 prior land disputes and the men who had profited alongside him each time. She did not accuse Constance directly. She simply laid the facts in a straight, unbroken line and let the room draw its own conclusion. Because her father had taught her that the truth does not need you to win, it only needs you to say it clearly enough that no one in the room can pretend afterward they did not hear it. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes without pause, her voice steady, her hand steady. Her father's old Blackstone opened flat on the rail in front of her, and more than once she paused only long enough to let Judge Marrow himself check a page against the county registry copy his own clerk had been made to fetch that same morning. Mr. Redgrave, seated near the back beside 2 of Silas Grady's other associates, shifted in his chair each time a new date was read aloud, and by the time Eliza reached her final page, he had stopped shifting altogether and simply stared at the floor. Ellery Crane rose twice to object, first claiming the registry dates were a clerical matter unworthy of the court's attention, and second suggesting that a woman without formal legal training could not be trusted to interpret statute language correctly, and both times Judge Marrow, now leaning forward with real interest, overruled him and asked Eliza to continue. Judge Marrow's boredom did not survive the 3rd page. Ellery Crane's confidence did not survive the 4th. Whispers moved through the gallery the way silence had once moved through that summer parlor. And this time, it was Silas Grady's allies who could not meet each other's eyes. Edmund rose when it mattered, calm and precise in the register of a man who had spent 15 years being careful, and was finally choosing to be brave instead, and confirmed, as a former practicing attorney, that the dating discrepancy Eliza had identified was not a technicality, it was proof of forgery on its face. Judge Marrow set the document aside, ordered a full county inquiry into Silas Grady's dealings, and restored to Eliza Hartwell the legal claim to whatever remained of her father's estate. If watching a woman turn 3 careful pages of evidence into a courtroom of stunned silence gave you even a small piece of satisfaction, do me a favor and tap that follow button before you keep reading, because this ending is worth staying for. Constance Ashworth did not apologize that day, but something in her rigid posture loosened as she watched her son stand beside a woman in a plain gray dress and speak with more conviction than she had heard from him in 15 years. In the weeks that followed, the coldness between them thawed slowly, not with dramatic words, but with small offerings. A shelf of her late husband's law books quietly moved into a modest schoolhouse building, a note left without signature that simply said her husband's books were well placed. Outside the courthouse steps that same afternoon, with the heat still heavy over Marrow County, Edmund found her standing alone in the shade of an old oak, and told her plainly that he had spent 15 years being the most careful man in every room he entered, and that watching her stand in front of Judge Marrow that morning had reminded him what it looked like to be brave instead, and that he did not intend to forget it again. She told him she had not done it for him, and he said he knew that, and that this was exactly why it had mattered so much. Edmund and Eliza did not rush toward each other the way people do in simpler stories. They built something slower and steadier, morning by morning, argument by argument, until these almost smiles she had watched flicker across his face for weeks finally arrived, complete, quieter than she expected. More honest, the smile of a man who had stopped performing and started simply being, and was discovering that being was considerably better. With the small settlement recovered from her father's estate and a parcel of land Edmund insisted on gifting rather than lending, Eliza opened a modest 2-room school on the edge of the county, its sign cut from cedar and lettered by Edmund's own hand, reading simply Hartwell School. She had planned for 10 students and 17 arrived. On the first morning, daughters of tenant farmers and tradespeople, 2 girls whose freed mother had walked 4 miles to bring them, a girl named Grace whose father had told her that morning that learning was wasted on girls, and whose mother brought her anyway before he woke. In the days between the hearing and the school's opening, Eliza kept careful accounts the way she always did, tallying not money but hours, lumber, and promises. And Edmund kept his own quiet ledger alongside hers, building shelves in the evenings after his county duties were finished, sanding each board twice because he said a room meant to hold a girl's first book deserved better than rough edges. Talbot, the steward who had once handed her Constance's note with a carefully blank face, came by one afternoon with a wagon of donated chairs he said had simply been sitting unused in the Ashworth attic, though everyone in the household understood exactly whose idea that donation had been. Louisa came to help on opening morning, not as a student, but as a young woman beginning her own studies in earnest, calling it the only kind of help that truly mattered. Constance arrived unannounced, as was her way, and stood at the edge of the yard watching a 6-year-old named Faith touch the spine of a law book with one careful finger. The way a person touches something they have been told is valuable and cannot quite believe is real. And something in Constance's face came fully undone, quietly, without drama, the loosening of a woman who had finally seen, after 30 years, the very thing her late husband had always tried to tell her. Standing in the doorway that morning, Eliza looked at 17 open, uncertain, present faces looking back at her, and she thought of the gray dress, the Latin in a candlelit parlor, the 3 careful pages, and the 2 coffee cups on a library table, and she understood exactly what it had cost to arrive at this exact threshold. She set her father's Blackstone down on the desk, looked at the room, and told them plainly that their minds belonged to them. Not to their fathers, not to their husbands, not to the county, not to anyone who had ever looked at them and decided in advance what they were worth, that it was theirs, it had always been theirs, and no document, forged or otherwise, could ever take it from them. Then she opened the book and said simply, "Let us begin." Years later, when people in Merrow County told the story of that summer, they rarely agreed on every detail. Some remembered the Latin first. Some remembered the French. Some swore they had been standing close enough to hear the French themselves, though they had not. But everyone who had truly been in that parlor agreed on one thing, that the silence after Eliza Hartwell spoke had a different weight than any silence they had heard before or since. The weight of a room realizing, all at once, that it had badly underestimated someone. It did not end with a rescue or a fairy tale. It ended with a deed in a woman's own name, a room full of girls who had been told no, and a man who finally learned, at 35, the difference between being intelligent and being brave. Some people are hidden not because their minds are small, but because the world has worked very hard to convince them otherwise. And sometimes, in courtrooms and parlors and quiet servants' rooms, where powerful people speak in languages they assume you cannot follow, the bravest thing a person can do is answer back in every language they know, at full volume, without apology. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I put it together, subscribe for more forgotten Virginia stories. Drop a comment telling me which line hit you hardest, and share it with the one person in your life who has ever been underestimated and proved everyone wrong anyway.